Hey, good morning, everyone. I hope you're having a great morning. So, this week's Torah portion is the portion of Vayera, and we read one of the saddest stories in the Bible. It's a story of Sodom and Amorah, or as you say, Sodom and Gomorrah. These cities, wealthy five cities that were so morally depraved, that were so selfish and self centered that God had to literally destroy the cities. You can imagine there were probably affluent cities, maybe like a nice gated community in America. They probably had a good school system, but they couldn't share and take care of those that were less fortunate than them, those that were destitute. The Torah tells us a terrible story, one example of when there was this one woman who fed the guest, which was not allowed in the city. And that what happened was that they took her out and they doused her in honey and they left her hanging on a tree so the bees should bite her and kill her till she died. And when God heard her cries, God decided to destroy the city. And Abraham comes and he negotiates with God. And he says, God, how could you destroy this city? How could you kill the people? Maybe I'll find 50 righteous people and you'll save the five cities. There'll be a minion in each. And then he can't find 50. And God, he says 40 and 30 and 20, etc. Till he realizes there's no one that's even worthy to save there. And God tells him that the cities will be destroyed. And that's when God tells him he will save his nephew Lot. Remember, Lot in the last week's Torah portion separated from Abraham and went to Sodom and Gomorrah. Now Lot had some of the social justice and kindness of his uncle Abraham, and he was kinder than the people there, and therefore God decided to save Lot. Sodom is, tradition has it that Sodom is today where the Dead Sea is. Some people say actually the Dead Sea is where God turned the whole city into salt. The Dead Sea is 1,240 feet below sea level. It's 10 times saltier than any other waters. That's why plants, vegetation, fish, nothing could live in there. That's why it's called the Dead Sea. And in fact, if you ever go touring in Israel, some tour guides might show you this pillar of salt that looks like a woman with a shawl and tell you that that is the wife of Lot, whose name was Irit or Idi, depending on the opinion. We're not sure if that's who it was. Back in the day of the Talmud, there definitely was a place where you could see Lot's wife. In fact, there's a whole discussion in the Talmud which blessing you should make. What happened to Lot's wife? What does Salt have to do with Lot's wife? So the Torah tells a fascinating story. God told Lot and his wife, I'm going to save you. But it's on one condition. And the condition is that you don't look back when you're running away from the cities as they're being burned. One condition. And then the Torah tells us that they were leaving the city, and Lot's wife looked back, and she turned back to see the cities, and she turned into a pillar of salt. That's what the Torah tells us. But the question is, what's the connection? First of all, what was so wrong of her looking back? Some commentaries say she looked back because she wanted to see if her daughters-in-law came with her, because first they were hesitant. Some commentaries say she looked back because she felt bad for the people that were being hurt. What was so bad about looking back? And why did she turn into a pillar of salt out of all things? In fact, interestingly enough, at your Shabbos table, if you make the motzi, you always know tradition is that we dip our challah into a little bit of salt. Why the salt? What's this fixation on salt? We always dip our bread in the salt. So of course there's the simple explanations, and the rabbis give many of why salt, how she was, how Lot's wife, when Lot brought in the guests, she was upset, and she went around to all the neighbors saying, "Oh, we need salt because we have guests," to get Lot in trouble and to out him. There's many reasons, but as I told you before, there's always a metaphor and a deeper explanation and meaning to everything we study in the Torah, and it has some deeper meaning to us. You see, Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom doesn't just represent the city. It represents a little part of each and every one of us that's narcissistic, that's self-centered, that's self-driven, that only thinks about itself. It's that time when we let our instincts that aren't good take over our kindness, our caring, and we can only focus on I, and I. We're only thinking about ourselves. And what happens is, many times when we encounter this stone within us, this self-centeredness, this narcissistic part of us, we try to run away from it. But when we try to run away from it, one of the things we do is we wallow in it. We go away and we keep on thinking about all the guilt we have, oh, what I did, how I only thought about myself, how I only cared for myself, or we think about the things that happened to us, and we wallow in this guilt. And sometimes we tend to feel good about it. We think, you know what, I'm wallowing. That means I really regret it. And that means that I'm really on the right track. But what the Torah is telling us is something very powerful. You see, the whole idea of leaving our struggles, of leaving Sodom, is to stop thinking about ourselves and to think about somebody else. To stop thinking about me, I, and think about the other, about God, about another human being. But when all we do is wallow and think about ourselves, then it's no difference than when we were narcissistic. It's the same narcissism. Think about it. Some people love themselves and think they're superior, and some people think about themselves and love themselves and think they're inferior, but it's all about them. The Torah is telling us that when you make a mistake, when you encounter that narcissistic self, you need to turn away from it. But you can't wallow in that guilt of what happened. You see, that's why on every Shabbos table, we dip our challah into salt. What's unique about salt? Salt in Judaism and Hasidic philosophy represents our guilt. But what's unique about salt? Try to take a tablespoon of salt and eat it. It's bitter, it's revolting, it's inedible. In fact, if you ever make even a salad or anything and by mistake you put an extra salt, you can't eat it. You'll throw the whole thing out. Salt on its own, or when there's too much salt, is terrible. But a little bit of salt could enhance any dish you make. If it's salad, if it's meat, if it's chicken, if it's eggs, if it's fish, salt, when you put a little bit of it, enhances the food and makes it taste delicious. And in fact, salt also is like a preservative. If you put a little bit of salt into something, it lets it last longer. The rabbis tell us the same is with the guilt. When a person moves away from his narcissistic self and he has guilt, a little bit of guilt is good, because a little bit of guilt keeps us honest. It keeps us real. It keeps us focused away from ourselves onto someone else. It reminds us of why we're here. It reminds us of the social justice and the kindness that Abraham taught us, and not to be like stone. But when we only have the salt, when we only wallow in our guilt, then what's really happening is that we're not leaving ourselves. We're only finding ourselves in a different way. We're not focusing on the future, on the other. We're only focusing on ourselves. The story is about this woman who had 2 chickens, and one chicken got sick. So she took the healthy chicken and she killed it, and she made chicken soup for the sick chicken. But you can't cure guilt with more guilt. The way to cure guilt is by leaving it, by leaving the past, by leaving the narcissism, by leaving that focus. And that's why in every Shabbos meal, and also every sacrifice that was brought in the altar in the temple, had a little bit of salt, because it reminded us that a little bit of salt enhances the dish. But when there's too much salt, it spoils the dish. So my friends, as you remember Sodom and Gomorrah this week, as you remember self-centered, narcissistic and we remember not to be like Sodom, to care about those that have less than us, to be sensitive, to be loving, to be generous. We remember that as we move past that part of ourselves, we focus not on I, not on the superior or the inferior I, not on what I did or didn't do, but what I could do for someone else. And the same thing I think is this election season. Tomorrow's election day, and we're all getting sick of it. We're ready to be past it. And the truth is that Wednesday's going to come, or the next week, or the next week. And it's going to come a time when we're going to have to move past what I thought, what I wanted, who I was, and try to heal as a nation. Try to recognize that within ourselves and people of other thoughts, of other parties, there's so much that we have in common, that we love our country, that we care, that we want to help others. And we need to be able to move past what I wanted and be able to heal as a nation and be able to care for those that are less fortunate than us and bring healing and hope to this great nation of America. May God bless you all. Have a great day.